From the very moment Karoline Leavitt and Donald Trump stepped up to the podium, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Reporters, camera crews, political analysts, all eyes were fixed on the stage. Bright lights illuminated the pair, while pens clutched tightly and microphones pointed like weapons, ready to catch a stumble, a misstep, a moment of weakness. But it wasn't fear that filled the room. It was anticipation. This wasn't just another press conference. This was a battlefield. Karoline Leavitt stood next to Trump, poised and collected. Her demeanor was calm, but her eyes were sharp, measuring, alert. She had done this before and clearly knew the game. One wrong glance, one misplaced word, and the media would twist it into a headline designed to go viral. But today, they weren't getting that chance. Every gesture, every breath was deliberate. There was no hesitation. She wasn't here to survive the press. She was here to command it. Trump, on the other hand, didn't need any adjustment period. He was in his element. He stepped forward, adjusted the microphone, and without clearing his throat or blinking, he launched into a pointed opening. "I'm sure you all have some very fair and unbiased questions, right?" he said, the sarcasm cutting clean through the silence. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, but no one dared respond. It was Trump's way of taking control early, reframing the moment before the reporters had chance to. The synergy between Trump and Karoline was undeniable. They didn't interrupt each other or overlap, but rather built off one another's energy with seamless precision. When the first question came, delivered by a front-row reporter with the polished tone of a seasoned TV anchor, it was clearly designed as a trap. "Mr. Trump, with the upcoming election, many Americans are worried that your policies are dangerous for democracy. How do you respond to those concerns?" Trump didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head and fired back with a question of his own. Which Americans? The ones watching inflation crush their wallets? The ones watching crime take over their cities? The reporter hesitated for just a second, long enough for the crowd to sense the power dynamic shift. Trump wasn't playing defense. He was forcing the media to define their vague accusations, to be accountable for the generalizations they so often relied on. Then Karoline stepped in, measured, confident, composed. "I think what you mean," she said, locking eyes with the reporter, "is that people are tired of being lied to, tired of being told their problems aren't real, tired of being gaslit into believing things are better than what they see with their own eyes." The room shifted. A few journalists exchanged glances. Cameras zoomed in. But Karoline didn't stop there. "They don't distrust institutions because of rhetoric," she continued. "They distrust them because they've seen those institutions fail again and again." It wasn't just a good answer. It was an indictment, a powerful accusation aimed not just at the media, but at the entire political establishment. It set the tone. This press conference wouldn't be dictated by headlines or gotcha questions. It would be defined by truth and the courage to say it plainly. What set this moment apart was not just what was said, but how it was said. Neither Trump nor Karoline raised their voices. They didn't lash out emotionally or fall into reactive traps. Instead, they spoke with clarity, purpose, and precision. The message was unmistakable. They were not there to apologize, to explain away, or to placate. They were there to challenge the premise itself, to hold the media accountable for the narratives they had long controlled. When a different reporter tried to reframe Karoline's comments as an attack on the free press, she responded without blinking. "No, I'm saying journalists should do their jobs." A beat of silence followed. Trump laughed, leaning into the microphone. "Yeah, you should write that down." The moment wasn't just sharp, it was commanding. Every response was calculated to flip the script, to reveal the bias woven into every question. This wasn't just a defensive press conference, it was an offensive one. Trump and Karoline weren't dodging the attacks. They were dissecting them, turning each question back onto the asker, forcing the media to reckon with their own contradictions and selective outrage. The old playbook, trap questions, loaded phrases, emotional bait, wasn't working. Trump, experienced and fearless, kept pressing. When reporters stop asking real questions and start manufacturing stories, they're not journalists. They're activists with press badges. The words landed hard, not with anger, but with authority. And Karoline backed it up not with slogans, but with calm, assertive logic. Together, they were a force, unbothered by the spectacle, focused on the message. This section of the press conference, its opening act, was less about answering questions and more about setting the rules of engagement. Trump and Karoline made it clear they were not interested in playing the media's game. Instead, they were rewriting the rules in real time. No apologies, no retreat, just facts, framed with unapologetic confidence. And the result? A room full of seasoned reporters suddenly unsure of how to respond. The usual smugness was gone. In its place, silence, hesitation, and quiet recognition that, for once, they weren't in control of the story. As the press conference moved forward, the atmosphere grew sharper, more electric. The media had come in expecting to dominate, to control the flow of questions, and maybe even catch a few viral moments to turn into headlines. But now, something was different. The rhythm was off. They were reacting instead of leading. And it all came down to how Trump and Karoline were playing the game. Not defensively, but with deliberate, unflinching offense. It started with a question laced in strategy. Ms. Leavitt, are you saying the press shouldn't question authority? That journalists should just accept what politicians say without challenge. It was a classic setup. The implication was that any criticism of media bias was, by default, a threat to the free press. But Karoline didn't take the bait. She leaned slightly forward, her voice unwavering. No, she said, I'm saying journalists should do their jobs. The words hit like a cold slap in the face. Clean, simple, devastating. She didn't raise her voice or lash out. She didn't need to. The silence that followed said everything. Trump, standing beside her, grinned. Yeah, you should write that down. That one line shifted the tone of the entire event. It wasn't just a clever comeback. It was a reset. Karoline had drawn a clear line between journalism and activism, and she wasn't backing down. When a reporter pressed again, trying to get her to admit that conservative media also spreads misinformation, she didn't deflect. She took the fight straight to the heart of the issue. I'm saying when CNN spends for years pushing a Russia collusion hoax and then quietly walks it back, that's not journalism, she said. When mainstream outlets bury the Hunter Biden laptop story before an election and only admit it's real when it no longer matters, that's not journalism. That's election interference. You could feel the tension in the room tighten with every word. The reporters knew this wasn't just a talking point. It was a direct accusation, backed by facts and delivered with surgical precision. It wasn't about opinions anymore. It was about accountability. Then came the question the media had likely been saving for Trump, their go-to tactic whenever things get out of hand. Will you accept the results of the 2024 election, regardless of the outcome? They expected Trump to be defiant, maybe even reckless. But instead, he leaned into the microphone, calm and measured. I'll accept a fair election, he said. Then, with a slight pause and a knowing glance, he added, will you? That moment changed everything. It wasn't just a rhetorical jab. It was a direct challenge to the very journalists who had spent years undermining the legitimacy of the 2016 election. Karoline saw it, the flicker of hesitation on the reporter's face, the realization that they had walked right into the same trap they had tried to set. The silence that followed was telling. For a brief second, no one moved. No one responded. And then, predictably, another reporter tried to pivot. So, to be clear, you're saying the only way the election is fair is if you win? Another trap, another headline in the making. But Trump wasn't shaken. I'm saying Americans deserve to know the election is fair. Period, he said. That's what real journalists should want, right? That's when the real shift occurred. The press conference transformed from a controlled back and forth into a battleground of ideology and integrity. The questions weren't just inquiries anymore. They were desperate swings, trying to land a hit on Trump or Karoline. But both stood firm. A young journalist in the front row, clearly eager to make his mark, launched a new line of attack aimed squarely at Karoline. You keep talking about media bias, but aren't you just deflecting? If things were as great under Trump as you say, Wouldn't the facts speak for themselves? It was slick, calculated to make her seem like she was avoiding real issues. But again, she didn't hesitate. "Oh, the facts do speak for themselves," she said calmly. "You just don't like what they say." She then rattled off a list of achievements from the Trump administration: record low unemployment, rising wages, energy independence, followed by a stark comparison to the current state of inflation, crime, and border chaos. Her tone remained steady, confident. She wasn't debating. She was presenting evidence. "You don't want facts," she said, voice firm. "You want sound bites. You want something you can clip, twist, and turn into a headline that fits your narrative." The room shifted again. Gasps, glances, keyboards clicking hesitantly. It wasn't just that Karoline was winning the exchange. It was that she was exposing the entire framework of how political press conferences are often manipulated by the media. And everyone watching, both in the room and online, could see it. Then came another question, this time from a senior reporter. "Ms. Leavitt, are you saying journalists shouldn't challenge politicians? That the media should just accept everything Trump says?" Karoline smiled, just a hint, no warmth. "I'm saying journalists should challenge every politician," she replied, "not just the ones you don't like." Trump jumped back in, driving the point home. "I remember when the media used to challenge people in power," he said. "Now if a Democrat says the sky is green, you print it like it's a fact. And if we say it's blue, you call it misinformation." Laughter, nervous, strained, rippled through the room. But no one dared to challenge the logic directly. Not because they agreed, but because they knew the moment they spoke, they might prove them right. That's what made this exchange different. Trump and Karoline weren't just countering narratives, they were exposing how those narratives were built. And in doing so, they weren't just fighting back. They were winning. As the press conference wore on, something subtle but unmistakable happened. The energy in the room shifted. What began as a confident, even aggressive line of questioning from the media slowly began to unravel into uncertainty, hesitation, and eventually outright defense. It wasn't that the reporters had run out of things to say. It was that their usual tactics, leading questions, emotional framing, carefully planted traps, were no longer working. Trump and Karoline weren't flustered. They weren't retreating. In fact, they were gaining momentum. It became clear that the traditional media script was falling apart. Reporters who normally dictated the rhythm of a press conference found themselves reacting instead of leading. Each time they tried to pivot, Karoline and Trump saw it coming. Each time they tried to trap, it was they who got cornered. The power dynamic had flipped. One of the most telling moments came when a reporter asked, "So you believe the media is the enemy of the people?" A heavy question, carefully worded, aimed to corner Karoline and bait a soundbite that could be used against her. But she didn't blink. "I believe the media should hold power accountable," she said plainly. But when reporters stop asking real questions and start manufacturing stories, they're no longer journalists. They're activists with press badges. That line hit hard. The room grew tense. You could feel the discomfort ripple through the crowd. No one had expected this level of composure, this level of clarity. Karoline wasn't there to win over the press. She was there to expose them. Trump didn't miss a beat. He leaned into the microphone with a tone that was half bemused, half deadly serious. "You people never learn," he said, and the room froze. Then came a sharp, direct question from the back, delivered by a seasoned journalist known for his confrontational style. "Mr. Trump, isn't it fair to say that you benefit from division? That media distrust actually helps you?" It was a strategic move. Paint Trump as a chaos agent. Frame him as someone who thrives on distrust and discontent. But Trump shut it down with a clarity that cut through the noise. "No," he said simply. "The media isn't distrusted because of me. It's distrusted because you lie. Repeatedly. Consistently. And when you get caught, you just move on like nothing happened." That sentence hung in the air like a verdict. He continued, building his case like a prosecutor. "You spent years pushing the Russia hoax. You called the Hunter Biden laptop Russian disinformation. You told Americans inflation was transitory. You downplayed the border crisis until it couldn't be ignored. And when all of it turned out to be wrong, you never took responsibility." Some reporters looked down at their notepads. Others glanced away. The silence in the room wasn't respectful. It was revealing. It wasn't that they didn't have answers. It was that they knew the answers wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. A younger journalist attempted to cut in and regain momentum, but Trump held up a hand. "No, don't try that," he said. "I know the play. You'll take one sentence, rip it out of context, slap it on a headline, and pretend it means something else. That's the game, right?" It was a brutal moment, not because it was loud or angry, but because it was true, and everyone in the room knew it. Then Karoline stepped back in, calm as ever. "You know what the saddest part is?" she asked, scanning the press corps. "It didn't have to be this way. There was a time when the media actually had integrity, when people trusted it. But now, you've turned your own profession into a joke. And the only people you have to blame for that are yourselves." Another pause, another silence. But this time it wasn't just awkward. It was damning. In that moment, it became clear the media had lost control, not just of the room, but of the narrative. For years, they had dictated how press conferences unfolded, carefully steering the public conversation with framing and selective editing. But today, none of that was working. Trump and Karoline weren't reacting. They were leading. The journalists weren't challenging power. They were scrambling to defend their own credibility. A veteran reporter in a Navy blazer tried one last time to bring it back. "Mr. Trump, you've repeatedly claimed the 2020 election was unfair. Are you telling your supporters now that the only way you'll accept 2024 is if you win?" It was a return to the old playbook. Paint Trump as a sore loser. Question his respect for democracy. But Trump was ready. "I'm saying Americans deserve a fair election," he said firmly. "And if we had a press that actually did its job, you'd be asking that same question to Democrats who spent 4 years calling 2016 illegitimate." He leaned forward. "You sat here and called me an illegitimate president. You pushed conspiracy theories. Hillary Clinton still says the election was stolen from her. So tell me, are you going to ask Joe Biden if he'll accept the results?" The reporter opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Just a flicker of hesitation, barely a second, but enough. Karoline sealed the moment. "The truth is," she said, voice clear, "you don't want accountability. You want submission. You don't want fairness. You want control." No one had anything left to say, not because the press had run out of questions, but because Trump and Karoline had taken away the script. They had exposed the routine. And now, any attempt to continue playing it only proved their point. For the first time in a long time, the press wasn't running the show. They were on defense, cornered by the very truth they had tried to shape. As the press conference drew to a close, the air in the room felt different, thicker, heavier, as if everyone present understood something profound had just occurred but couldn't quite put it into words. The reporters, who had arrived confident and prepared to control the narrative, were now sitting quietly. Some stared at their notes, others typed furiously, attempting to salvage something, anything that could be spun into a coherent headline. But the usual tricks weren't working. The press had lost control of the room. And worse, they knew it. Trump, ever the showman, leaned back from the mic, a half-smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Karoline gave one last glance toward the crowd before stepping away from the podium. It was over, but not really, because what had just happened in that room wasn't just a press conference. It was a moment, a shift, and it had already begun to spread. Outside the building, a crowd had gathered, supporters watching live streams on their phones, waiting for Trump and Karoline to emerge. As the doors opened and the two stepped into the daylight, the atmosphere exploded with applause and cheers. People chanted their names, waved flags, and held up signs. Whatever had just happened inside had only amplified their message outside. And within moments, clips of the event were already flooding social media. Unedited, raw, and impossible to ignore. One clip showed Karoline delivering her now viral line, "You don't want accountability. You want submission." Another captured Trump asking the press, "Will you accept the results of a fair election?" A question so sharp in its irony, it required no commentary. These weren't sound bites filtered through a media outlet's lens. They were firsthand, and they were spreading fast. Within hours, hashtags began trending. Hashtag do your job. Hashtag media exposed. Hashtag Caroline claps back. People from all across the political spectrum were weighing in, some applauding the performance, others scrambling to discredit it. But no one was ignoring it. The clip had legs, as they say in media circles, and it was running faster than the media's ability to shape its meaning. The most notable shift was that Americans didn't need a news anchor to tell them what they saw. They had watched it live. They had heard the questions, seen the answers, and judged the exchange for themselves. For years, many had felt gaslit, told that their instincts were wrong, that their concerns weren't real, that to question was to be a threat. But now, they were witnessing something different. Someone had stood up, not behind closed doors, not in some obscure article buried on page 6, but live in front of cameras, challenging the system directly. And that, perhaps, was what made the moment so powerful. A reporter from one of the major networks tried to salvage the narrative, chasing Trump and Karoline down as they approached their vehicles. "Ms. Leavitt, Mr. Trump, do you stand by everything you said today?" she asked, voice urgent, mic outstretched. Trump didn't even stop walking. "No thanks," he said casually, dismissing the ambush with a wave of his hand. But Caroline paused. She turned, locking eyes with the reporter. "Find one thing I said that wasn't true," she said, calm and direct. The reporter opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Because in that moment, she couldn't. Not without twisting the facts. Not without doing exactly what she had just been accused of. And everyone watching, on the sidewalk, online, across the country, noticed it. That was the difference now. There was no delay between event and reaction. Number 6 o'clock news segment required. The people were the audience and the distribution system. The gatekeepers had lost the gate. Inside newsrooms across the country, editors scrambled. Producers issued new directives. Find a new angle. Minimize the clips. Focus on Trump's tone. But it was too late. The story had already escaped their grasp. What made the moment irreversible was not just the confrontation itself, but how organic the response was. It wasn't just die-hard Trump supporters cheering. It was average Americans who had, for years, grown quietly distrustful of the institutions that claimed to speak for them. Now, those people had seen someone say the things they'd been thinking out loud, and in the face of those who had tried to silence such thoughts. Caroline, in particular, struck a chord. She wasn't just a political figure reciting talking points. She embodied a generational frustration. Her calm dismantling of manipulative questions, her refusal to accept false premises, and her insistence on facts over narratives gave voice to a sentiment many had carried silently. We're not crazy. We're not alone. And we're not backing down. Meanwhile, Trump played the role he knows best, the disruptor. The man who didn't come to make peace with the media, but to call them out. And unlike in years past, he wasn't doing it alone. He had an ally at the podium, one who could deliver the message with sharp precision and calm authority. By the end of the day, legacy media outlets were issuing panicked headlines. Trump doubles down on election doubts. Leavitt attacks free press in viral exchange. But those headlines rang hollow. The footage was already out. People had seen the full exchange. They weren't reading interpretations. They were watching facts unfold, unfiltered. And in this new information age, seeing is believing. The old gatekeepers had long relied on being the sole narrators of public discourse. But now, the audience was no longer passive. They were awake, engaged, and equipped. They didn't need someone to tell them what the story was. They were the story. And as Trump and Caroline climbed into their cars, waving to the crowd as they pulled away, it became clear that something fundamental had changed. Not just in that room, not just in that moment, but in the larger game itself. The narrative was no longer theirs to control, and that, more than anything, terrified them. As the vehicles pulled away from the press conference venue and the crowd's cheers faded into the distance, the moment left behind was not just a political event. It was a cultural shift. Something had changed, not in policy or in power, but in perception. The confrontation between Trump, Karoline Leavitt, and the mainstream press wasn't just another media skirmish. It was a public reckoning. For decades, the press had occupied a position of dominance. They shaped narratives, determined public focus, and often decided who would rise or fall in the world of politics. But in this press conference, the curtain had been pulled back. Americans had witnessed, in real time, a challenge to that dominance. And more than that, they saw it fail. Trump and Karoline had entered the room prepared not just for questions, but for war. Not a war of shouting or insults, but of clarity, facts, and unshakable resolve. From the very first moment, they flipped the script. They refused to accept the premises of loaded questions. They demanded accountability not from their supporters, but from those holding the microphones. They didn't plead for fairness. They exposed the lack of it. And the media, so used to being the predators in these engagements, found themselves cornered, disarmed, and for once, exposed. Karoline's performance was particularly significant. Young, composed, and relentlessly focused, she represented a generational evolution in conservative leadership. She didn't just support Trump's message, she sharpened it. With calm precision, she articulated frustrations that millions of Americans feel daily. Being lied to, being ignored, being told their reality is wrong. When she said, "You don't want fairness, you want control," it wasn't just a jab at the press corps. It was a mirror held up to an entire system that too often rewards conformity over truth. And the silence that followed that statement said more than any editorial could. Trump, for his part, delivered the performance his base has come to expect. But it wasn't just bravado or crowd work. It was methodical, strategic. He understood exactly what the reporters were trying to do, and he dismantled it piece by piece. When he said, "The media isn't distrusted because of me. It's distrusted because you lie," he wasn't being provocative. He was being honest, brutally so. And in the stunned expressions of the journalists in that room, the truth landed. But the most important part of this press conference wasn't what was said. It was what couldn't be denied. The people watching didn't need spin. They didn't need talking heads. They saw it for themselves. The questions, the answers, the hesitations, the pivots, they were all visible, unedited, unfiltered. And in the age of instant video, no headline could undo what had been witnessed. This moment proved that the monopoly on narrative is over. The media, in its traditional form, is no longer the sole gatekeeper of truth. It cannot ask a question, chop up the response, and feed the public a version of events that fits its editorial bias, at least not without consequences. Because now the audience talks back. They fact-check in real time. They share clips, not interpretations, and they decide what matters. For Trump and Karoline, the win wasn't just in the applause or the online virality. It was in the shift of momentum, in the stunned silence, in the fact that for once, the press conference ended not in a flurry of shouted follow-up questions, but in a hush, an uncomfortable realization that they had lost control. It was a rare, raw moment where the media's usual armor of confidence cracked. And through that crack, the public saw what had been hidden: bias, narrative building, selective outrage. And perhaps most importantly, fear. Fear of losing relevance. Fear of being challenged. Fear of being replaced by the truth itself. Because the truth, as Karoline demonstrated so clearly, doesn't need embellishment. It just needs a voice strong enough to say it plainly. As the press regroups, as editorial boards hold emergency meetings on how to cover this moving forward, one thing is certain: they're no longer unchallenged. The game has changed, and it's not one they can easily rig. For supporters watching, the press conference was more than political theater. It was validation, proof that their concerns are real, their doubts justified, and their voices not alone. For critics, it was a wake-up call that the tactics of control and narrative domination are losing their grip. And for the neutral observer, it was a reminder of what journalism is supposed to be: truth-seeking, not truth-bending. So as the headlines continue to spin and networks scramble for damage control, the lasting image isn't of chaos or controversy. It's of two people standing firm, holding the line, and forcing the press, for once, to answer to the people. In the end, it wasn't just a press conference. It was a declaration. The era of narrative control is over. The truth has a mic now, and it's not giving it back.